What started as an idea for a next-generation trucking simulation game is now getting closer to release. Roadkings is without a doubt one of the most anticipated titles for this genre, and with only a few months left on the clock, we have some very important insights from its creators. The first dev block released a few days ago, and we can finally understand the idea behind the game, what made it possible, and how it's coming together. And without spoiling too much before we properly get into it, the way they are presenting it makes it clear that they are aiming to create a whole experience that goes beyond driving, and the main character here will be the trucker, unlike any other games where everything revolved around the truck. The first part of this dev blog is basically them giving us context on how this project started, and it tells us what their vision was. According to the developers, the idea came around 5 years ago, when Saber and Focus began exploring the possibility of building a next-generation trucking simulation game, but with the intention of approaching it from an entirely different angle. That distinction is actually something that gives me hope, because at the very least, we know that they knew what they were going for the very beginning of the development. And part of that perspective comes from their previous work. Their earlier off-road titles like SnowRunner or MudRunner, they already focused on heavy vehicles operating under difficult conditions, where maybe terrain, weight, and the control constantly influenced the outcome. But what they took from that experience was the idea that players respond to situations where the environment pushes back and forces you to adapt. But obviously moving into long-haul trucking wasn't easy. Still, it was an extension of that philosophy, where the challenge is bigger than just mud or snow, and it expands into time pressure, logistics, and the realities of operating on open roads as maybe an owner-operator. That transition helps explain why the initial concept for the game is not centered purely on, expanding its scale or improving realism in isolation, just like ETS2 and ATS is constantly doing. Instead, it suggests that the attempt to carry over that sense of pressure and decision-making into a different context, one that is closer to everyday trucking. The emphasis is less on creating a bigger map or a more detailed vehicle than in, say, ETS2 or ATS, which is probably why we haven't seen all that much about them being teased. It sounds like it's all about the trucker, the person behind the wheel. So they're banking this game's entire success on the premise that they will be able to create a working structure while multiple systems interact with each other in a way that shapes how each gameplay session unfolds, basically creating a full trucker's experience that is affected by the world around us, the economy, the weather, the business decisions that we make and whatnot. And if you think that this sounds like an ambitious idea, you bet it is. In fact, you can imagine to move all this from a concept to an actual game. Clearly they needed help. So they needed a team that could translate all this into a reality we would get to play in 2026. So that's where Saber Porto came in. They are the studio leading development for this, and their role was to actually build these systems that could actually support this broader direction, tying together vehicle handling, world interaction, player decisions, the economy behind it all, the business side of things, into a massive immersive experience. So now that we know a bit more about where this game is heading and what it's trying to achieve, my opinion is that it will all try to be maybe a love and hate relationship between vehicles and the person behind the wheel. But it begs the question, can this actually be done? Is it even realistic to think that you can find a good balance between trucking and being a trucker and put that into a game? And I talk about this idea of everyday truckers, and it's being romanticized in a nice way. About people moving goods regardless of the weather, distance. They called it the heroes of the modern days. And that's nice, right? But that framing is interesting, and it places the player in a role that it's less about the driving, I guess, and more about the responsibility it will take. And it also explains why there's so much attention placed on the industry itself. The developer blog spends a surprising amount of time talking about how trucking has changed, how it is influenced by technology, by the shifting supply chains, and even by increasingly unstable weather conditions. From there, you can start to see how the gameplay might actually take shape. I don't know about you, but if this is true, I'm sold. This sounds amazing. But at the same time, that's what I feel like things start to feel a bit difficult to fully picture. Because the more you think about it, the more you realize how many variables this approach would depend on. And they would have to be working together in a convincing way weather, economy, time pressure, decision making, world interaction. All of these systems would need to align for that ultimate trucker experience to feel real. And it's not that I have a reason to doubt that what they're saying is true, but the scope of it all is so large that it raises a natural question of how much this can actually realistically come together in a way that feels as deep as it sounds. In the final part of their dev vlog, that moves into the technical side, they let us know about the switch to Unreal Engine 5, which should bring major graphic improvements, but also things like denser assets, more detailed vehicles, fully dynamic lighting and environments that feel consistent. So on paper, all of this points towards a world that feels realistic. Maybe this engine is the magic answer that we've been waiting for, that would make all this possible. But still, it's the scale of what they're aiming for that's worrying me. This is a game that tries to simulate the trucker, the industry, and the reactive world all at once. And you can imagine that this depends on a level of cohesion that is truly difficult to achieve, especially in an open world setting, which is a very relevant mention. Because let's look at Docked, for example, which is a recent game they released. It tries to combine heavy machinery, a management system, and a character progression in a way. It had a strong similar idea, but it lacked an open world format, I guess. And because of that, everything felt structured rather than lived in. A next-generation trucking simulator needs to have that sense of continuity. Even if it's built through, connected regions or isolated maps, it still has to feel like a journey and not a sequence of missions. And that's why this dev block leaves me in a bit of a mixed place. I am more interested in roadkings than I was before because the direction is genuinely ambitious, and if it can be achieved, it will be like nothing we've seen before. But at the same time, I want to stay grounded and say that that ambition is exactly what makes it difficult to fully believe it until we actually see it working. It's a very tall idea to execute, and it would be a shame to see it fall short. I'm curious about what you think as well, and as always, until the next time, stay safe on the road and keep on trucking. Cheers.